Thank you so much. Hello, everybody. Welcome to my afternoon. I'm so excited. I do have the best job right now. I was just telling folks, I got to talk to our produce growers this morning, and then I get to come in today and I talk to our potential grazers or people who already have their grazing operations. It's a really cool job, and I love working with farmers. So thank you for asking me to come and talk with your program. So I am going to just touch on, Mike mentioned, I am going to just touch on various points. It's really kind of an issue spotting opportunity for you to think about that there's some of the legal considerations for when you're planning a grazing operation. How many folks actually already have a grazing operation? Okay, all right, great. So some of these things you may have already considered and thought about. I certainly hope that you have. Some things may be new to you folks. But again, we're just going to breeze through. I got 30 minutes with you, and I'm going to make the best use of it that I can. I do want to tell you that a little bit about the Ag Law Education Initiative. So Maryland has a really wonderful program where we do provide legal specialists, and I'm one of them. And we travel across the state, and we do programs providing information on the various legal aspects of your farming operations. And we are a resource for you guys. So we have an online presence, of course. We have a web page. We have some of my colleagues tweet. I don't tweet, but they do. We have a Facebook page that you can like, and we have an email, and we do check that inbox, and we do answer questions. So if you have any questions after today, after talking with me or listening to me, please send them to the email inbox. Also, I'm going to give you my contact information, so please feel free to reach out to me directly. And I'm also going to direct your attention to some of the handouts that I brought with me. One is my business card. The other is a brochure for Ag Law Education Initiative, which has all of this information on the screen on it. And the other is a legal services directory that provides information about lawyers in all of the region, Maryland, of course. And you will find then their specialty of law in there, and you can locate particular attorneys that work with farmers, so ag law, contract law, a variety of other issues as well that come up. Okay, so those are, I'm going to leave those for you, and you can grab those at your leisure. All right, so let's talk about legal considerations for grazing operations. So first of all, we're talking about grazing operations, so we're definitely talking about animal agriculture, right? So animal agriculture, and I'm standing over here because I want to make sure everybody can see the screen, but animal agriculture certainly carries with it, just by virtue of the nature of having animals, it carries potential legal risks for liability. And those are risks certainly from injuries caused by livestock. So maybe you have a particularly grumpy goat that likes to headbutt anybody who comes into the field. So every livestock owner needs to understand the laws concerning liability for personal injuries or property damage that might be caused by their livestock. Excuse me. And then you have to understand those liabilities potentials in order to create your risk management plan, right? How are you going to deal with those potential liabilities? So I'm going to highlight some of the common legal risks that come with owning livestock animals, and then we're going to talk more specifically about some of the legal risks that are unique to grazing operations. And I'm going to talk really about Maryland law, so I think everybody's from Maryland, but just understand that I'm talking about Maryland law today, and if you have questions about other state laws, I'm going to direct you to that service directory where you can talk to lawyers in other states, okay? And I'll also share some strategies to limit some particular potential liabilities with you. There we go. Okay, first order of business. I am an attorney, but I am not your attorney, okay? So I'm going to talk very generally, like I said, very quickly too, probably, about some aspects of liability associated with grazing operations in Maryland. But for advice about how or what your particular risks are for your operation, I'm going to encourage you to talk to an attorney, right? And somebody who's going to get familiar with your business. I'm also going to encourage you to talk with your crop insurance agent, right? And talk about what are those potential liabilities, how can you limit those liabilities, and how can you manage that risk. I'm also going to encourage you to talk to your homeowner's insurance agent, particularly if your home is located on your land. I'm also going to encourage you to talk to any, if you have a business liability policy, right? I want you to talk with your agent about that policy as well. You see some heads shaking, so good. These are things that people are already thinking about. Okay, so liability for personal injuries caused by livestock. Like most states, in Maryland, you're going to be liable, right, for any injuries caused by your livestock. Personal injuries That's going to include personal injuries, and personal injuries include bodily injuries. So that goat that knocks somebody off on their keister, right? We're talking about personal injuries, bodily injuries, or property damage. Damage to a neighbor's fence that's caused by your livestock, for instance, or maybe damage to somebody's car if they come and visit your farm and they park on your property, and I don't know, a cow sits on the car or something. But or maybe your cow decides that they're going to play with the ladder that's being used by the guy that you hired to come and paint the barn, right? So in that case, we might be talking about bodily injuries as well as property damage to the ladder. So that is not Photoshop. That happens, right? Under Maryland law, to be held liable for injuries that are caused by animals, the animal itself must be what's called a domestic animal. Under Maryland law, it has to be a domestic animal. So in other words, you are not responsible for injuries that are caused by wildlife that's on your property. But you do need to know that domestic animals do include livestock. And then you also need to remember, I think, and pay attention, and we forget sometimes, it also includes pets. So those dogs and cats that are on our farms, if those are your pets and they cause injury, there's also potential liability there. Maryland law provides two different types of liability for personal injuries. One is strict liability, which you may not have heard of. The other is negligence liability, which you may have heard more about. We talk first about strict liability. So strict liability, under strict liability, you can be held strictly liable for injuries that are caused by an animal breed that has a, quote, well-known propensity for aggression. And that's regardless of whether you're negligent or not. So I don't know what everybody's going to be putting on their pastures, but just be aware of this, all right? I'm sure that you're probably familiar with cases where of pit bull owners where they have been held strictly liable for injuries to somebody, even if the animal had never bitten somebody before. And the reason that they can be held strictly liable is because the pit bull breed has been deemed a breed to have, to be a particular breed that has propensities, well-known propensities for aggression. What I really want to stress to you about strict liability, however, is that you can also be held strictly liable if an animal has caused previous injuries, or you knew that there was some natural tendency within the animal to commit injurious acts, and then they indeed do injure somebody. So for example, if you know that your bull has destroyed a fence in order to chase people who come near its pen, or maybe that bull has chased you one day, and your neighbor is over helping you separate cattle, and the bull, lo and behold, climbs the fence, charges and severely injures your neighbor. Under that circumstance, because you were aware of that previous behavior on the part of the bull, you can be held strictly liable in that instance for any injuries to your neighbor. You would not be held strictly liable in that instance, however, had the bull never shown any previous aggression, right? So, but depending on the facts of the case, it is possible that you could be held in that instance liable for your neighbor's injuries because of your negligence. Okay, so going from strict liability to finding you liable under negligence standards. So negligence liabilities stems from owing a certain duty of care to individuals and then failing to provide the same standard of care that a reasonable person would provide under those particular circumstances. So in the case of livestock injuring someone, the injured person is going to have to show that you owed them a certain duty of care to protect them from some foreseeable injury, right, that you could foresee happening, and you failed, in fact, to exercise that effective control over the animal when it was reasonable to expect that injury would occur. Okay. So I've talked a little bit about liability just in dealing alone with the fact that you are raising animals, right? I want to talk about the different duties of care that are owed then for people on your land, because again, we're talking about land, operations that include land, always, right, with ag, almost always with ag. The duty of care that's owed to the injured party is going to depend on whether the injured party holds a particular status under Maryland law, either as a trespasser, as a licensee, or as an invitee. Okay. Anybody familiar with those terms already? Okay, I wasn't expecting you to be. Licensee. So, good question. So, trespassers and licensees are people that you don't invite onto your land. A trespasser is somebody you probably has no idea is even on your land, right? You have no idea that they're there. They trespass onto your property unbeknownst to you. A licensee is somebody that you may allow to come onto your land, but you don't necessarily invite them onto your land. Okay. An invitee, however, is somebody that you do invite onto your land. So the duty of care to, yeah. I would, well, I'm going to, somebody that you, well, I always go to hunting, but we have particular laws around hunting. But I'm going to, are you offering a suggestion? Or? I was just going to service people a lot of times, yeah. So you know the electrician or somebody's going to be on your property, yeah. Yeah, exactly. But I always think about hunting first, and then I have to catch myself and think, no, there's more specifics about it, but good question. Absolutely. So each of those different categories of people who might be on your land, you owe them a different duty of care to each of them. Now, for trespassers and licensees, they're owed the lowest duty of care. You just need to make sure that you are not creating hazardous conditions. So we're not going to be digging the ditch and setting up an ambush for potential trespassers. If you become aware of a potentially hazardous condition, then you need to rectify that. Okay, but you don't have to go search your property to make sure that everything is reasonably safe for trespassers or for licensees as well. You owe the same duty of care, and that is to not wantonly or willfully create situations or allow hazards to exist on your land that could injure someone. An invitee, though, is owed the highest duty of care. An invitee is going to be a person that, again, you invite onto your property. So customers that you may have come visiting your property, depending on what you're doing with your animals in your land, or if you're offering goat yoga on your land. If you invite customers onto your property, your customers are going to be deemed under the law as invitees, and you owe them the highest duty of care. And that duty is to protect them from unreasonable risks and to keep the property reasonably safe. This means you should inspect the property for dangerous conditions. You need to make sure that you warn of any hazards that you know of, and you need to remedy those unsafe situations. So for landowners, I want you to make sure that you're aware of that. For people who are going to be landowners, I want you to be aware of that. Questions? More questions on that? Good question. Well, economic benefit can't. That's a very good question. You're going to have to look more deeply into that. In terms of, may not be a strict exchange of money on the in that particular situation, but yeah, but is it marketing for your farm, or are they buying other things while they're there? It's going to be fact specific, actually. Yeah, but good questions to pay attention to and to think about when you're. Again, we know farmers are savvy, creative marketing, and people are doing interesting things with their land and their farm. So you want to pay attention and make sure that you talk about that with your attorney or your insurance agent or both. Yeah. Okay. As you develop your liability management plan, I want you to consider working with your attorney, like I said, and an insurance agent, and to think about developing those strategies to limit your liability from livestock. The first step in determining the strategies that you're going to consider is taking into consideration whether any of your livestock has a history of acting in ways that could injure someone. So those things that we talked about. Do you know whether you have cows or goats or that have chased you or have chased employees or other people? You're going to need to consider where your land is located and how likely it is that your livestock is going to come into contact with third parties. Do you have trails running by your land? Are you on a road? Those kind of considerations. Some of your strategies for how you're going to limit your liability are certainly going to first include providing notice of livestock on fences, by hanging signs on fences, or making sure that you have proper insurance coverage, and I would suggest both. In some cases, I'm going to raise this and talk about this with a lot of caveats. In some cases, again, if you're inviting people onto your land for whatever purpose, right, for some as customers or clients, you might consider having them sign a general release or a general waiver. And what I've posted up here is what you'll find on ALEI's website, and it really is for educational purposes. So this is something that you're going to read through and maybe take to your attorney and talk more with your attorney about maybe creating a waiver of liability for your customers to sign when they come onto your property to prevent, to release you from any liability that might be caused, for injuries that might be caused by your livestock. But again, that's an educational tool that's on our website, and it's something that I'm going to encourage you, if you're thinking about bringing people on, we have people who, horse riding or goat riding. Can you ride goats? Goat yoga is killing me. But think about talking in specifics with your attorney and your insurance agent about what your plans are. Okay, fencing. All right, so we are talking about grazing, right? Grazing operations. So we need to talk about fencing because in Maryland, the courts have adopted the common law rule of fence in. This is different than Western states. If you're coming from the Western states, that's more of a keep people off your property, right? Keep livestock out of your property. Maryland has a different rule. They're going to require you to fence in your livestock. It prohibits unrestrained grazing of livestock and requires livestock owners to fence their stock to prevent livestock from damaging neighbors' properties. So the fence-in rule places the burden of the fence construction on the landowner with the grazing livestock. It can also force one landowner to pay the costs of erecting a fence, though there are ways, of course, and we'll talk more about these, that neighboring landowners can share in the cost. They can create an agreement to share in the cost of construction, and I'll go into that in more detail in just a minute. But understand that you have an obligation under Maryland law to fence in your livestock. Maryland has no statute or court decision as of yet that defines, however, the exact standards for constructing a fence. So, what are the things that you're going to need to consider then when you're thinking about putting up a fence and we're thinking about limiting our liability? Well, you're going to definitely want to consider that you're using the correct height for the fence, depending on what your livestock is, the correct number of posts, the correct materials for the fence, all that you need to take into consideration about what's going to be necessary to contain your livestock. So for example, if you're pasturing cattle on your property, then you need to build a fence with the right kinds of materials, proper height, appropriate post distance, and numbers of wires to keep that cattle within your pasture. Those are things that you're going to contemplate. And I'm sure you're going to think about that anyway because you don't want to lose your cattle, right? Has anybody actually already been through the process of erecting fencing on land? And okay, anybody having a fencing? Okay, right, right, and maybe done a fencing agreement? Yep, 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 yep. Well, that's probably okay. Always, yeah. But fencing is obviously going to be an issue. And so let's talk about also, I wanted to touch on stream fencing. As part of the, I wanted to let you know that as part of the strategies for implementing the Chesapeake Bay Watershed Implementation Plan, the Maryland Department of Agriculture has listed as a best management practice stream protection with fencing. So if your property has streams running through it, or your fences that are built to keep livestock out of a stream, and that can be either temporary or permanent fencing, is considered a best management practice. Also, as I understand it, cost share funds are available if it's permanent fencing, not if it's temporary, but if it's permanent fencing. You're shaking your head yes? Okay. I also want you to think about if you are considering putting in stream fencing, I'm going to encourage you to talk with your soil conservation district ahead of time. Yeah, for exact specifications, but also to find out if it's necessary. That's been a recommendation that's been made to me, yeah. Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. Okay, you've got a fence between two neighboring properties you're talking about, and livestock on one side and cropland on the other. And so we get an animal that breaks for a reason because the fence is in need of repair. The animal gets through, destroys the cropland. Okay. And you're asking who's going to be liable for that? The livestock owner. The person who owns the livestock, not necessarily the landowner, and we'll talk about that because you could be leasing, right? The livestock owner could be leasing that land. Person who's responsible for fencing in the livestock is going to be responsible for that. Does that answer your question? Okay. Okay. All right, now what you really want to know is about who pays for the fencing, right? Because livestock owners are required to keep their livestock fenced in, it's the livestock owner who is required to build the fence. And neighboring livestock owners neighboring landowners are not required under law to share in that expense. That differs in some states, so that's why I'm pointing that out. A livestock owner is required to keep the fence. Also, the livestock owner is, of course, required then to keep the fence in good condition and to repair any defects. Okay. What about fencing agreements? These are the agreements that I started to touch on. Maryland has no law, of course, that prohibits neighboring landowners from agreeing among themselves to share in the cost of erecting the fence. And that's regardless of whether one or maybe even neither own the livestock. Again, we might have land that's being leased, right, to somebody else who owns the livestock. But you can have an agreement among yourselves to cover the costs and repairs, et cetera, of the fence. I want to note that in Maryland, like in other parts of the country, sometimes it's just kind of customary for two livestock owners to split costs, including the maintenance and the erection, et cetera, and the upkeep responsibilities of a division fence. The problem with the custom is that a lot of times that's just an oral agreement, right? And the only people that know about it are the people that were in the room at the time the agreement was made. So what you may want to consider if you're in that circumstance or if somebody's approaching you with wanting to make an agreement with you on division fencing, you may want to consider writing that agreement down. And what that agreement should cover, whether it's written down or not, but especially if it's written down, what that agreement should cover are those things listed up there, certainly. How costs are going to be shared, the standard by which the fence's condition is going to be measured. So when is it actually going to be deemed to be in need of repair? You're going to include in that, and I'll discuss this in a second in more detail, but some kind of dispute resolution. And the best time to talk about is how you're going to resolve disputes or before the disputes happen, all right? And all the other conditions for the construction and upkeep of the fence. All right, so those are things that you're going to want to make sure that you touch on in your agreements. Okay, so for example, I've got an example here. So Bobby and Greg agree to build a division fence between their two properties. And in the agreement, these are the things they agree to. Bobby and Greg agree to split the cost of construction, and they agree that Greg will be required to pay for the future repairs. And then they agree that Bobby is to keep up the left half and that Greg is to keep up the right half, and they pick a center point. They identify the center point. This is, you got to get into the details here. Bobby and Greg also agree to use a mediation process to settle any disputes that could arise. And if you don't already know, Maryland Department of Agriculture provides mediation programs for disputes that affect farmers. Okay, so they're a resource, actually a free resource for dispute resolution. Yeah. I think they're most definitely not lawyers, actually. That's my understanding. Good or bad, but I think definitely not lawyers. Has anybody used if you'd want to disclose, has anybody used the mediation process? Or, yeah, it's a really a wonderful service that they provide. I know I'm talking about maybe potential lawsuits here, but I can't stress it enough. The best way to avoid a dispute is for Bobby and Greg to be constantly communicating with each other, right? If problems come up, you need to talk about it and get ahead of it, and that's going to be the best way to avoid a dispute that might lead you to court to resolve. Okay. In addition to having the, well, let's talk about another reason why we should put this agreement into writing. You probably want that agreement to be enforceable against any maybe future landowners, right? Somebody comes in and buys that property that you had you had an agreement with the prior property owner about fencing. You want to make sure that that agreement is going to bind the new owner, the new landowner, right? To do this, you're going to need to make sure that the cost share agreement meets requirements for a real covenant. I am not going to, thankfully, I am not going to tell you all the requirements for a real covenant. What I'm going to tell you is that it is going to be a written agreement, and you're going to want to talk to your attorney about what has to be in that agreement in order to make it, in order to meet the requirements for a real covenant to run with the land. It runs with both pieces, all parcels, right, involved in the agreement. And there is actually more information in some of the publications that ALEI puts out about what is required if you want to take a peek and look at the requirements for a real covenant. But just understand and be aware that those are some of the issues that you're going to want to pay attention to. Okay. I want to also make you aware that Maryland law does allow for home rule where counties can regulate fencing. This means that, and I don't know how well you can see that, but this means that you're going to want to check your individual county's regulations to see if the county has any laws or ordinances related to division fence requirements. What is in the table that I've provided for you up here is information about Howard County, Kent County, and St. Mary's County, just to show you the different approaches that each of those county ordinances take. These three counties have been granted the authority by the state to regulate the construction and maintenance of fences, to provide for a procedure to enforce the rights of parties with reference to a fence, and to provide for a lien to repairs to a fence made by an owner who's not in default. In other words, the owner who's not in default can put a lien for repair costs. Okay, these county ordinances on fences clarify many of the unresolved issues that exist in Maryland. They specify the minimum height and strength a fence should be built to, how construction and maintenance costs will be allocated, and also a procedure for collecting unpaid costs. But even if your county does have a specific ordinance, the possibility still exists for you to create a written agreement that goes above and beyond what's specified in the ordinances. So don't think that just because you have a county ordinance, you aren't able to get a more well-defined agreement between landowners about division fencing. And I'm going to breeze through a little more here because I'm always out of time. Grazing leases. Let's talk about that real quick. Okay. Whoops. Here we go. If a landlord with an unfenced property and a tenant who wants to graze livestock on the property enter into a grazing lease agreement, they'll need to consider the terms in the lease that specify how the cost of constructing the fence will be handled. Again, you're going to be required to fence in your livestock. This is going to be part of any lease agreement. So I want people who are landowners who might be leasing their land to understand this. I want people who might be the people, right, who are leasing the land to livestock owners. I want the landowners to understand what's going on, and I want the people who are going to be leasing the land to understand what's going on. Okay. So also understand on both sides of that equation that landlords can and should require the tenant to have sufficient liability insurance, also to name the landlord as an additional insured on that policy. The landlord should also require the tenant to provide a certificate of insurance each year for the lease. And those are things that, again, issues that I want you to be aware of if you're in a leasing situation. Liability for stray animals. Okay, so here's another question I know you want to know. What happens if a vehicle hits my cow and someone is injured? Can they sue me? And the answer you're going to get from a lawyer is it depends, right? But the question isn't really, can they sue me? The question is, what does the law say about who's responsible in that situation? Because they can file a claim, right? But let's figure out if you have liability in that situation. In Maryland, if livestock stray because the livestock owner did not fence in his or her stock, or if the fence is in disrepair and that allowed the livestock to stray, the livestock owner is going to be liable for damages. When somebody else has come in and damaged your fence unbeknownst to you, it depends. Did you know about it or did you not know about it? If you knew about it and you didn't make a repair, then yeah. But if you didn't know about it, no. You can't rectify what you don't know. But you do have to, but again, no, go ahead. Right. And that's going to, Right, and that's, I think in that situation, I'm sure that's going to be pretty fact specific. In other words, if that was a common occurrence and it happened before, did you go back and make sure that that gate was more secure? Should it happen again? Those kind of questions are going to come up in that instance. Did that answer your question? Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, in fact, how to avoid liability. Regularly check your fences. Immediately repair damaged portion of the fence, right? Regularly check to make sure your gates are kept closed. Again, if the livestock owner fences in the livestock somehow escaped through no negligence on the part of the livestock owner, then the livestock owner is likely not going to be held liable, right? Because you can't obviously know every situation that's going to happen under all circumstances. I am wrapping up. Okay, so everything that I talked about today and much more actually is in 2 publications that are available on ALEI's website. So I encourage you to look there. And if you have additional questions, you might find some answers there. Yeah. Right. Right. Well, first of all, remember our duty is going to be very low for a trespasser, right? And if the fence is within, and there are going to be certain standards for the electric fence, right? But if you're within those standards, likely that there won't be any liability on your part. Well, those are going to be, that's going to be associated with what's required for the standards to erect electric fencing. Yeah, so if you, whatever the, again, not knowing where everybody's from, but whatever the requirements are for if you put up electric fencing and you're required to have certain signage, then yeah, that would have to be in place. Sure. Yep. Yep. Hmm. Well, I'm gonna give you a general answer because you're going to want to talk to your attorney about the details. But in terms of seeking recourse through the courts, the first thing you're gonna have to show is some kind of monetary damage. Okay, because what courts can give you is money usually. Also injunctions. You can also force them to erect a certain type of fence, and that can be agreed upon in the end on what that's going to be. So that could also be a recourse under that. And then yeah, you're gonna there will be some proof that this has happened before. He's been made aware of it, right? In order to hold him liable for any damages. That's a very general question to a really fact-specific situation. But it happens, of course, things like that do happen. That help? Yeah. Okay. All right. I'm going to get the big hook here. But I want to tell people we do also have a risk management blog that you can go to and keep updates on current changes in the law, nationally and locally. If you have questions about your grazing operation, talk to an attorney. They can help. Look for our resource guide if you need to locate an attorney. We did some questions. I like that cow. All right. Thank you so much, guys. So glad to have a chance to talk with y'all.